that only 52% of UK adults actually voted in the general election, and they're saying that's the lowest since 1928. So, really since universal suffrage, by looking at people who weren't even registered. And they say that non-voters would have been the largest party at that election.
Well, let's speak now to political correspondent Terry Stiastny. Morning, Terry.
Chloe.
This is a difficult one, isn't it, for Keir Starmer, just a few days into the job and sort of being dragged into this question about, President Biden's mental capabilities and how he performed in meetings with the Prime Minister.
Yes, it is a very tricky one diplomatically. And of course, you wouldn't expect Keir Starmer, after his first meeting as Prime Minister with the American president, to say anything sort of critical or disparaging at all, really, about how the meeting went with Joe Biden. And that's what we saw. He said that they had a good first meeting, that Joe Biden was across all the detail, and they talked for an hour about, very serious issues, obviously, including Ukraine, and he said that the president was on really good form. But obviously, in the backs of many people's minds, and having seen the press conference, many people will be, a bit concerned about what is going to happen next. But obviously, diplomatically, as the British Prime Minister on your first trip to Washington, you are hardly going to say anything about what you might privately have thought about how Joe Biden is performing.
Turning our attention to matters at home, front page of the Times today, talking about prisoners to be freed after 40% of their sentence served. This is all because, well, basically there are just massively running out of cells. Just explain to us what we are expecting the government to announce today.
Well, yes, we're expecting the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, to announce some emergency measures about overcrowding. She is expected to look at people who are serving sentences which were less than 4 years, people, potentially prisoners released after serving 40% instead of the usual 50% of their sentences. This would not apply to people who were sexual or serious violent offenders, or to some people who've been convicted of domestic abuse. And the problem really is that the prison estate is running out of space really quickly. It needs 1,400 spaces to run smoothly, with people being sentenced and leaving, and a turnover of people. There's currently about 700 spaces, and if there's fewer than 300, you run into serious problems very quickly. And so obviously this is something that needs to be sorted out in fairly short order.
And I guess the challenge for that is, clearly Keir Starmer's talked about, well, he did, didn't he? I think the day after he was elected, he talked about how there was essentially money in the pot to build prisons, but the Conservative government had been reluctant to do that. It takes time, clearly, to build a prison. The worry is going to be what happens to those prisoners who are released early. Is the probation service able to support them? What support will they get in the community? Because that's the big question for the government now, isn't it?
Yes, I think there are going to be quite a lot of questions, and obviously, the new government can for now blame this on the previous government, but what happens in the future, they will have to take responsibility for themselves, because of course if people are released early, prisoners, they are still released on licence, and they can be recalled to prison at any point if they are if they are breaching the conditions of their release. So you've got to have those spaces available in case potentially people need to come back. And of course, all the time as the courts go through the process, more people are being sentenced. And yes, in the longer term, the government will try to build new prisons and potentially change the way that people are sentenced or are treated if they're convicted of crimes. But all of that, as you say, exactly takes time. And this is a problem that's happening now.
We also understand that Keir Starmer is saying that he is not going to give in to union pay demands. This is something that accusations flew at Keir Starmer that he'd be a bit of a pushover before they came into government. This is going to be a test, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And of course, we've had lots of strikes in the public sector already. Wes Streeting is already talking to the doctors about their pay issues, but you've got a round of the pay review bodies coming up who are going to recommend pay rises, which are presumably, based on the past year or so's conditions in terms of inflation and things like that. The unions, of course, saying that they want those pay awards to be fully funded, but the government is insisting, as I suspect we're going to hear quite frequently, that the finances are in a very poor state, and that still this is not something that they can necessarily afford in all cases.
Let's also talk about turnout at the general election. A new report coming out saying that turnout was as low as 52%.
Yes, this is a report from the think tank, the IPPR, and although we knew that turnout in this election had been fairly low, what they have looked at is not only people who were registered to vote and didn't vote, but people who weren't registered. And so they've come up with a figure that only 52% of UK adults actually voted in the general election, and they're saying that's the lowest since 1928, so, really since universal suffrage, so by looking at people who weren't even registered. And they say that non-voters would have been the largest party at that election, and they've dug a bit more deeply into the kinds of people who are more likely to vote. And as you'd expect, probably older people, people who own their own homes, are more likely to vote, and they're keen that people should be registered and that more people get involved in the process.
Terry, good to speak to you as ever. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's political correspondent Terry Stiastny.
Just on prisons, Stuart gets in touch to say if a criminal is given a prison term of, say, 4 years, why allow him his freedom after 2 years? If there's a good argument for this, then explain why 50% is correct while 40% is not. I suspect that a first-time prisoner is punished far more by having a criminal record at all than by having spent time in incarceration, where criminality is, by definition, the common factor among the inmates.
Presumably, though, when sentences are handed out, they know that they're only going to serve half the
Half the
time.
time.
Everybody knows that. The justice system knows that. The prisoner knows that. It's kind of
It's all a bit odd.
It is a slightly bizarre thing. Interesting here as well. Tom says, on prisons, the question for the Conservatives is how on earth did they allow the prison estate to get into such a dangerously appalling condition? As for the government, they need to tell us how they intend to manage so many additional criminals in the community. While there's no question prisoners need to be released early, if they aren't adequately supervised, many will no doubt return to crime. We're going to be speaking to someone formerly of the probation service a little bit later on to exactly look at this, because that is the challenge, isn't it? If these people are released, which clearly they have to be, because otherwise we're going to run out of space, what support is there for them in the community?